This is a lecture on the role of women in early America between the years of 1600 and 1800. If you're in my History 131 course, please be sure that you've already looked at the intro lecture for this, the one that gives you definitions about sex, gender, and sexuality, and looks more in depth at why it's so important to study the topic of gender and sexuality in history. This will give you a very good background before you really jump into the role of women in early America. In order to really understand the role of women in early America, you have to look back at the role of women in England just prior to the era of conquest, because most of our gender norms were actually taken from European society and brought to the New World. And there were two big issues that were happening right around this time period that influenced gender norms. And the first of these is that in the 14th century, the Black Death was spreading throughout Europe and Asia. And at this point, Europe's population actually declines by almost 40%. And the way that this is actually connected to gender roles is that prior to the spread of the Black Death, women were not allowed to join guilds. And guilds were essentially craft unions, and each different trade would have their own guild. And the guilds would ensure that the crafts that were put out were of a good quality, that there were some price controls so nobody could undersell another person, and they would take care of members of their guild. But as the population begins to dwindle, for the very first time, guilds began to allow women into their ranks. And women never made the same amount as men, despite the fact that they were doing the same job, but this was certainly a new occurrence in European society. But of course, as soon as the population stabilized after the Black Death ended, women were kicked out of the guilds again. And yet during that short period of time where they were allowed to have guild membership, they had gotten a taste of economic success and freedom, and they were going to hunger for this in the future. The second big issue going on in this time is that there were many powerful European rulers who were females that were ruling in this time, and they were causing a lot of unease. People like Queen Elizabeth and Catherine de' Medici had a great deal of power, and yet the common view of women in the colonial era was that they were lewd and they were wanton and they were seductresses. And where this idea comes from is the story of Eve in the Bible. The fact that she was the seductress who tempted the fall of mankind by Adam eating a bite of the apple. And throughout most of the colonial era, women are portrayed as being liars and deceitful, and as being a wanton seductress who gets her way by using her feminine wiles. They're also seen as intellectually deficient when compared to men. And doctors felt that because they had a menstrual cycle, that they were unreliable at best, and that at worst they were very dangerous in positions of power. And despite this, throughout the 1300s and 1400s, we see examples of extremely powerful women taking control in European society and beginning to challenge these ideas of gender norms. And of course, society pushes back and clashes with these new notions. Once European settlers arrived in the New World, they brought with them a system known as patriarchy, and all European colonies and countries were patriarchal, not just the British colonies, but also the Spanish and the French and those of New Netherlands. A patriarchy is a social system in which males were the primary authority figures. They were central to social organization. They occupied roles of political leadership, moral authority, and control of property, which means that in essence, a patriarchy is a society in which men are in charge of all facets of their government institutions, their church institutions, as well as their community. It was very important within a patriarchy in both Europe and in the Americas to control women's sexuality. And this was important because they had a system of inheritance called primogeniture. Under this system, it was typically the eldest son who would inherit the wealth of and the land of their father. And based upon this, you wanted to ensure that you were actually handing your land down to someone who was biologically related to you. Were a woman to go and have a relationship with someone who was not their husband, then it could entirely mess up the system of primogeniture as well as the system of patriarchy. Although patriarchy existed in each of the colonies, depending on whether you lived in a colony that practiced Roman law or one that practiced British common law, the expression of patriarchy might have looked different. Roman law was actually practiced in places like New Spain, New Amsterdam, and New France, and typically it was practiced in more Catholic nations. It was a legal doctrine in which women maintained a lot of important rights of inheritance and property holding. So you'll notice that in these places, women had far more rights than under British common law. For example, in New Amsterdam, it wasn't uncommon for women to run and own taverns and businesses. Now, those living under British common law included people living in New England, the Chesapeake, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. So that's basically anyone living along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And they had a system known as coverture. Coverture is a legal doctrine which they adopted from England, which upon marriage a woman's legal rights would be subsumed by those of her husband. It existed throughout the 18th and the 19th century, and you even saw parts of it well into the 20th century. So, when a woman was single, she would be known as a femme sole, and she would have certain rights that once she was married and became a femme covert, she might no longer have. A married woman could not own property. She could not own her own wages. If she were to have a job and earn wages, those belonged to her husband. Were her husband to abandon her and to come back several years later, he would still have a legal right to her wages. A woman could not sign a contract, she could not testify in court, and she could not own a business. This means that a woman's entire existence was tied up into that of her husband. You'll find that when I teach about the history of early American women, I often distinguish between divisions of class by talking about free Anglo-American women versus indentured servants, divisions of race by talking about white women versus African American and African women, and then also divisions by location when I look at the difference between the New England colony and the Chesapeake colonies and between those that live under Roman law and British common law, because it would be a mistake to assume that the experience of one woman really represents the experience of women as a whole. When we look at the sex ratio for the New England colonies versus the Chesapeake area, it's far different. So the experience of free Anglo-American women is very much going to depend on whether they live in a New England village or whether they live on a farm or plantation in the Chesapeake. In New England, you had about 2 women for every 3 men, which meant that family formation was much easier there, and that most of them settled down into these small insulated villages. In the Chesapeake, the ratio of men to women was about 6 men for every 1 woman. When you look at the 1619 census of the English and other Christian people in the Virginia colony, for example, there were 677 men to 119 women. And then later on in the century, men outnumbered women at a ratio of about 3 to 1. And this ratio really reflects the fact that the colony relied upon tobacco cultivation, and this was not something that women did. This was primarily a male occupation. It also slowed the creation of stable families, and it's something that company leaders from the Virginia Company had hoped to achieve early on. In 1621, a member of the company wrote, quote, "The plantation can never flourish till families be planted and the respect of wives and children fix the people on the soil." And English colonists viewed the family really as the basic building block of society and government, and they wanted to establish traditional nuclear families wherever possible. And when this wasn't the case, you will find that the roles of women are going to be much different in areas where there are fewer women. In the Chesapeake region, people lived on isolated farms and plantation, and for the most part, the people that they saw on a daily basis were just members of their household and their own family. And plantation families usually consisted of just parents and children, sometimes from numerous different marriages because of their high death rate. Because of their relatively few numbers and this sort of isolated farm life, most women had very few opportunities to actually interact with other women. And with such an uneven sex ratio, it wasn't uncommon for groups of young men to live together. If you compare this to New England, in contrast, the Puritans and the Pilgrims of New England did not experience the same level of mortality that plagued the colonists in places like Jamestown. And while the Chesapeake specifically recruited unmarried people, those who migrated to New England typically came in family units, and nobody, not even young men, were permitted to live outside of a family group, which means that women were constantly in contact with other women. Now, New England society was centered much more around a self-sufficient family farming model than the tobacco plantations of the South, and while mortality rates caused many couples in the South to have to remarry, it wasn't uncommon for those in New England to reach their 25th anniversary. Now, despite the fact that there are some very clear differences between the lives of free women in both of these places, there are some similarities, and there's two in particular that jump out. The first is that women's daily work in both places remained centered on production for the family. The women of both Jamestown and New England had different motives for migrating, but once they got to the colonies, their role in society and family was very much the same. It was part of the private sphere, taking care of the children, taking care of the house. And then the second similarity is that free Anglo-American women in both areas would have had this great pressure to marry quickly and to reproduce. And most married and bore children, usually about 5 to 7 children. But Boston's chief cleric named Cotton Mather actually recorded cases of women who had more than 20 children. And the reason that they would have wanted so many children is that they were needed to increase the farming labor force. The women of the early Chesapeake actually make a really interesting case study, and they had far more freedom prior to 1700 than they would after this time period because of the uneven sex ratios that existed. Now, because there were such high mortality rates in conjunction with this sex ratio, it wasn't uncommon for women to marry and then for their husband to pass away. And prior to 1700, despite the fact that they lived under coverture, women could actually inherit the property of their husband once he passed away, which meant that women who were widows could have a great deal of property and wealth. In addition, the first version of mail-order brides actually come from the Chesapeake area, where men would put ads in newspapers and they would offer to trade 120 pounds of loose-leaf tobacco for a suitable marriage partner, and women would come across from the old world to the new world, and in exchange for this loose-leaf tobacco to their families, they would become the wives of someone they might not even know. And one of the issues that they really had in the early Chesapeake was with rampant adultery. It was basically a buffet of marriageable and eligible men that these women could choose from. And even if a woman came to the colonies quite poor or from a less wealthy class, she could definitely climb the ranks of social hierarchy because there were so few women to pick from. And in addition to that, she might have an extramarital relationship, and she might not get into quite as much trouble as she would in other areas or later on in history because there were so few women to pick from that you would want to ensure that she remained as your wife. Despite the fact that women in the Chesapeake had just as many children as women in New England, they usually had smaller families because the infant mortality rate was so high. In some places, as many as 25% of all children died, usually in infancy, and so that meant that there weren't very many heirs to actually inherit the estate if their father were to pass away. And so while it was really unusual for a British woman to inherit a large estate, it wasn't that unusual for a woman in the Chesapeake, which meant that they already had more responsibility. But in addition to this, there were other ways that women could exercise autonomy. And while women weren't in charge of the government or the family, that didn't mean that they were completely powerless. The first means of exercising power was through network of gossip. And these networks of gossip could allow women to shame men sometimes into doing the right thing, and then in other cases they became very useful during Bacon's Rebellion and the American Revolution in essentially creating a network in which women could pass along important information. Now, the second way in which women really exercised power was through taking on the profession of midwifery. And midwives would be very well respected in their community. They were called upon to help women give birth prior to the rise of male physicians. And also, they would go around to various ailing people and try to help heal their sickness. One of the things that midwives were responsible for was if a young woman became pregnant and she wasn't married, they would practice something called 12 Angry Women, where these 12 midwives, or maybe a little less, would go into the room while she was giving birth, and they would pepper her with these questions about who the father of her child was. And the theory was that while she was in the throes of childbirth, she would be in too much pain to possibly lie, and thus they would be able to get the name, track down the gentleman, punish him, and then hold him accountable. And in some cases, that meant that the church actually forced this man to marry the unwed woman. Now, the last thing that these midwives could do, because they really were well respected in their community, is that they, as well as matrons, could be called upon to examine women. And we've seen this play out when I talked to you about the story of Thomasine Hall, where the court wanted to understand whether she was a man or a woman, and because of the fact that they believed she was probably a woman, it wouldn't have been appropriate for men to search her, and instead they called upon well-respected matrons within the community to do this. Now, although we're talking about free Anglo-American women, it would be wrong to assume that they just laid around the house eating bonbons and had servants doing all of their work. Instead, these women were responsible for a whole plethora of different chores, and this included reproduction, of course, and child rearing, and it wouldn't be uncommon for a woman to have a child nearly every 1 to 2 years from the time that she was married, maybe around the age of 17 or 18, until the time that she reached menopause, which would take a huge toll on their body. They were also responsible for healing and midwifery, for butchering, preserving meat, preparing the meat, and then preparing the hides, for milking cows, churning butter, and making cheese, for going to the market, and also for selling goods at the market, especially goods that they created to help out the family economy, such as selling candles or fat that was left over from cooking or rags that they had in the kitchen. In addition, they were responsible for brewing ale, and it was much more common for them to drink ale than anything else. Baking, gardening, cooking over a hearth, which was incredibly hard, and it wouldn't be that uncommon for women to catch their skirts on fire and even sometimes to burn to death. It wasn't like, today where you cook over a stove and it takes you half an hour to make dinner. It could literally take an hour to 2 hours just to cook a normal meal. And then, of course, they had to clean up afterwards. They were also responsible on occasion for working in the fields, so it wouldn't be unusual for a free Anglo-American woman to work in the fields the same way that an indentured servant would, and then later the same way that a slave would. In addition, they had to clean their home, do the laundry, help their neighbors. If anything happened to a neighbor's barn, for example, the whole community would get together for the barn raising, or if someone was sick and they couldn't actually harvest their fields, the community would come together to help them out. And then lastly, they were responsible for attending church, and this was much more common in New England, where they were located in villages, than in the Chesapeake, where they were simply scattered too far apart to have very many churches. Because the availability of education was based on gender, most women in the colonial era didn't have any formal education, and because of this, there was a really significant gap in the literacy rates of men versus women. Education was really costly to a family, and even if no tuition was actually charged for attending, children weren't able to provide the labor that the family might need, and so it could really cost the family quite a bit. It didn't really make a lot of sense because of this to educate girls when their education wouldn't really provide any financial benefit to the family. There was a very common assumption that education was a means of preparation for a role in the public life, and as we've discussed, women by definition were meant for the private sphere, and they really didn't have any role in the public. So many also believed that women were intellectually inferior to men and that they really couldn't and shouldn't be educated in the same manner as boys. So if a family really did want to educate their girls, they only had two real choices. They could either enroll them in a dame school, which was usually run on sort of an informal or impermanent basis by women who wanted to earn some income, but they didn't want to make a huge investment financially in a school. And these teachers usually weren't very well educated themselves, and as a result, they didn't really offer much more than a babysitting service with a little bit of instruction in reading and arithmetic. The second option they had was to hire a governess, and this was basically a teacher and a nanny all rolled into one, and they would teach the girls things like reading and writing, about the Bible, about domestic arts like cooking and cleaning, recording household expenses, how to play the piano or some kind of other musical skill, about foreign language, possibly they'd learn to speak French, especially if they were from a wealthier family, needlework, spinning, weaving, cooking, and nursing. But it was really only the wealthiest American families that could afford a governess, which was a tradition that has come from the aristocracy of Europe. In general, though, most women in the colonial era are not going to be highly educated. Women's access to education is actually going to improve right around the time of the American Revolution, because during the Revolution, women really proved their worth through food riots and boycotts, sewing homespun cloth so that they don't have to rely upon their mother country, and even in some cases fighting. And there's a real shift in the way that women are seen in American society around this time period. They go from being seen as sort of these wanton, lewd seductresses who can't be trusted to being seen as virtuous and in need of protection. And there's the birth of something called Republican motherhood. And this is the belief that women are so moral and so virtuous that they should be responsible for raising up citizens of the new republic. And because of this, they're going to need to educate their young children. And in order to educate their children, they need education themselves. And what they're going to do then is to bestow upon their children these new values of virtue and honesty and the need to protect the new nation. And so women, for their part, are going to have increased access to education. Up to this point, we've really only talked about free Anglo-American women, but now we're going to look at the lives of female indentured servants. I think it's really a myth that most people assume to be true that our early colonists relied upon slavery as their primary labor force, but until the 1680s, we relied very much on indentured servants, and this was particularly true in the South and the Chesapeake far more than it was in New England, where they relied upon the labor of people living in the village and the family. Now, these indentured servants typically would be sold into servitude for a period of 4 to 7 years, and they either were sold in exchange for passage to the New World as a husband and wife or a family, or most indentured servants were single, and they were convicts and rogues and prostitutes and cheats, and sometimes they were actually sent by the crown over to the New World in order to get rid of their problem. Now, child snatching and kidnapping of women became much more commonplace during this time period, and they wanted women to serve as the wives of plantation owners, and so these huge profits made from tobacco required a lot of manpower to be maintained and increased. So women were needed to breed and then, of course, to create workers on the plantations and to increase this fragile population because of mortality rates. And it was children who were 12 years and older that were really the target for child snatching because they were easy prey. They were homeless and hungry, and mostly they were better servants than a convict would be, so it wouldn't be that unusual for a child on the streets of London who's starving and surviving the best way he knows how, to be snatched, sold into indentured servitude, and forced to work for a period of 7 years before he can become free. And by this point, he's already in a country possibly away from his family that he may never see again. Compared to all of the other groups of women that we're going to talk about, indentured servants who were female probably had the hardest lives and the shortest lives in the early colonial period. Some of them were literally worked to death, and it wasn't uncommon for their masters to beat them or to rape them repeatedly. And there are court documents that show their masters being brought into court for either beating them or killing them or raping them. And rather than getting any serious punishment, they were simply forced to pay a bond for good behavior in the hopes that this wouldn't happen again, because these women were first of all seen as second-class citizens based upon their sex, and then on top of that, they were viewed almost as the property of their masters because of the fact that they were servants. And so that first year that they were a servant, they were really at the most risk for dying. It was particularly difficult for them because they lived right under the nose of their master in the same house, and in addition, there was often the jealousy from their mistress, who watched the master on occasion having a dalliance with them. Now, in addition to this, female indentured servants weren't allowed to marry without their master's permission, and it was really hard to get their master to agree to a marriage because, according to the gender roles that existed under coverture, a woman's husband was really the authority within the marriage. But this would also contradict the fact that the master had authority over her, so he wouldn't be very keen on allowing her to get married. And the punishment, should she go and get married without his permission, was quite drastic. A single woman who became pregnant without permission could be whipped, she could be fined, and on top of that, she could actually have her child taken away from her by the courts and have 2 years added onto her term. If the court wanted to do this, they could also add a 21-year term limit to the child so that the child would be a servant until they turned 21. Now, even if a woman became pregnant because she was raped by her master, she didn't get much sympathy from the courts because most judges assumed that women were very much sexual creatures and they enjoyed the activity as a woman, and they believed that because of the myth of mutual orgasm, you could not get pregnant unless a woman had orgasmed, which meant that it must not have been rape. So clearly the conditions that these women were working under were certainly not the best. Planter families often hired a white female indentured servant to be their housekeeper. They would have preferred her to a slave being inside of their home. And if they didn't hire her to be a housekeeper, they might hire her as a wet nurse. And a wet nurse would be responsible for actually providing milk to the children of the mistress of the house. And all throughout European history and well into American history, it was very common for wealthy, aristocratic in Europe families to hire a wet nurse because it would have been very inappropriate for a lady of means to actually nurse her own children. And then in addition to being a wet nurse, the indentured servant might also essentially be a nanny or a babysitter for the children. Now, in addition to both of these tasks, working as a maid or housekeeper as well as a nurse, prior to 1680, you would have seen women out working in the fields just the same way that men did, doing the exact same work as male indentured servants. Now, because of the difficulty of the labor, in conjunction with the poor way in which they're treated, the relationships between these indentured servant women and their employers were very seldom harmonious, and usually one or the other would terminate the connection as soon as the term of bondage ended. Now, increasingly during the 17th century, slave women from Africa start to replace both male and female indentured servants, and these women are experienced agricultural workers. Early on in the slave trade, slavers would capture the biggest men in Africa they could find, and they would march them from the mid part of Africa out to the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast, and then they would ship them across the Middle Passage over to the Americas or to the Caribbean, and they would set them to work in the fields. And they were increasingly surprised that these men didn't necessarily know all of the tricks of how to plant and harvest their crops in the fields. And so they began to realize that the division of labor between male and female Africans was much like the division amongst Native Americans, where the women were the ones who were primarily responsible for harvesting and working in the fields. And because Europeans hadn't realized that, they had made an error in predominantly choosing male slaves. And so over time, they began to slowly increase the ratio of female African slaves compared to men. And these women would have been expected to go out into the fields and to hoe tobacco along with the men and to do the exact same kind of back-breaking labor that male slaves had to do. Really, they're just a small part of the workforce in the Chesapeake until about the 1650s. By 1660, there's going to be slightly more slave women than indentured servants in the Chesapeake, and then all of this is going to change with Bacon's Rebellion, when the authorities and the government begin to worry that it's possible that poor free Anglo-Americans will unite with poor indentured servants and even with poor free blacks and form a coalition that might overthrow the government. And so in time they began to create this boundary between people of one color and people of another, and all of it is based around the fear of the government that all the poor people will band together and attempt to overthrow the wealthy. Both Anglo-American free women as well as Anglo-American indentured servants and African women worked in the fields, but only the African women became associated with agricultural labor. And the distinction is really clear when you look at British laws from the 17th century. For example, in 1643, Virginia decided to tax anyone expected to be working in profitable enterprises. This included, quote, all men over 16 and all Negro women, whether slave or free. And of course, this created additional burdens for black families that white families simply didn't have. Regardless of the fact that they are doing the same work, African women were considered producers for the market economy, and thus they were taxed, and Anglo-American women of European descent were not. And over time, you're going to see European women and whiteness becoming associated with chastity and virtue, and African women and dark skin being associated with immorality. And then slowly, the idea of crossing the color lines is going to become very dangerous. And as we move further into the colonial era and then later into the Victorian era, it becomes more and more important to maintain a very rigid boundary between people of various races. And white women in particular will not work in the fields after this happens. All slaves were forced to work under one of two different modes of slavery. There was the task system, and then there was the gang system. And with the task system, each slave was given some responsibility for the production of one crop, and they were given a particular plot of land that they would need to work. And one example of this would be the rice plantations of the Carolinas. This was a less brutal system of slavery because after they had finished their task, they would have some free time that they could use for themselves. And although I say it's a less brutal system, that does not mean that it was an easy one to live under. Now, the task system is usually going to be followed along the northeastern coast, where there are fewer rebellions occurring, and they're less worried about giving slaves free time and a little bit more autonomy. It's an offshoot of the division of labor that was already in place in the African tribal systems. Now, when we compare this to the gang system, slaves worked together on these successive projects one after another, and this allowed for continuous work at the same pace all day, every day, from sun up to sundown, and there was never any letting up or slowing down. And a really good example of the gang system is in the Caribbean on the sugar plantations. This was the harshest form of slavery. The work was rarely ever done, and this kind of slave system was used to suppress frequent rebellions. They would be too exhausted and too busy to be able to rebel. And one sub-form of the gang system is a trash gang, and these were groups of slaves, usually pregnant or older women and younger children, who would be delegated to lighter fields such as weeding and collecting trash and bringing water out to those working in the fields. The kind of labor that a slave woman performed would depend on whether it was daytime or nighttime. During the day, there was absolutely no gender division of labor. So in a society in which people believed that women were inferior to men, and that certainly they were unable to do the same physical demands of work that men could, they did not apply these notions to the slaves from Africa. And so most women would spend at least a part of their lives doing the exact same work as men. They would cut trees, they would haul logs, they would plow land, and they would cultivate crops. In the nighttime, there was a gender division of labor, where the men might have the night off, but women, who were the heads of their family, were expected to cook and clean and sew and do the laundry, and they did all of this alone. And so, while slave owners would often claim that they adjusted the workload of their slaves in order to accommodate their age and their physical condition and their gender, they really didn't typically do this. There was certainly an added value to slave women because there were certain tasks that plantation owners felt were best suited to slave women, and this was particularly because they would prefer to have slave women working in the house to men. One of these tasks would be the family cook, and cooks had probably the most freedom or autonomy out of all of the slaves. Most kitchens in the colonial era and the Victorian era were set apart from the house, and this was to ensure safety because they didn't want the kitchen to go up in a blaze and then for the whole house to burn down. And because of this, the cook really was in charge of her own domain. The other way in which slave women might be used within the household was as a wet nurse, and they were expected to use one breast specifically for the white children of the plantation, and then the other one for the black children, and if they were to switch up or to mix up these breasts, they could be punished by being whipped quite severely. And a slave woman was always forced to feed her child last. So if her milk ran dry, the owner would go and get a new nurse, and they would fire this one and move her out to the fields, and her children would just go hungry. Now, in particular, the enslaved were forced to eat leftovers or whatever they could grow in their little yards. So when she was forced to share her milk with the children of the slave owner, her children got little milk or nothing at all and could even starve to death. And then the last group that you would see would be the domestic servants in the big house, and the big house is simply the main plantation house set apart from the slave cabins, and typically they would start training a young slave as a child to become a domestic servant, and the opportunity was almost always given to someone with a little bit fairer skin. And then if at some point they became too old to work, they were no longer useful in the house, cleaning, doing the work of a maid, taking care of the mistress, then they would just drop them off and abandon them. For example, in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, he talks about how his grandmother, who served as a nurse to several generations of this family, was simply abandoned in a cabin in the woods with no way to feed or take care of herself by the time she became elderly. It's really important to note that the nature of slavery in the early years of the colonial period is much different than it would be in the later years. So, Virginia's slave law was quite flexible in the 1600s, for example, in the early 1600s, and a good example of this is Elizabeth Keyes. Elizabeth sued for her freedom in 1656, and she actually won this suit when she pointed out that although she was born the daughter of a slave, she was also the daughter of a free Englishman, and she was not only a Christian, which for a very long time had been the basis of declaring your freedom, but she was also the daughter of a free man, and she recognized that English law followed patrilineal descent, not matrilineal descent, and she played this card in the court system. It really represents the fact that in the early years, while slaves did not have the same status as free people or even as indentured servants, the nature of their place in social hierarchy wasn't exactly clear, and some slaves at this point still managed to buy their way out of slavery. Now, over time, this leniency would really change and the color lines would harden in the colonies. In the 1660s, the colonies really cracked down, and all children of a slave mother begin to be considered slaves. And by the time we get into the 1680s, this law is really ingrained in colonial society. Therefore, planters are actually claiming two different types of labor from slave women. First, they're receiving their productive labor in the field and in the household, and then on top of that, they're taking advantage of the reproductive labor of slave women who were often forced to mate with their masters or forced into breeding programs in which they were required to engage in intercourse with a slave of the master's choosing. So, in essence, being able to purchase a female slave meant that not only were you getting her labor, but you were resupplying your stock of slaves. Now, in the 17th century, they had miscegenation laws, and these laws existed in order to spell out what was allowed when it came to marriage between various people from different racial backgrounds. And all the way up until 1691, in most colonies, free people, regardless of their color, were allowed to marry. However, these miscegenation laws only concerned free people, so if a master had sex with a slave woman, then this was never really prosecuted in the court system. And most of the people who were punished under miscegenation laws after 1691 were free white women who had sex with African slave men. By 1700 or so, interracial marriages were really not recognized, and children of these unions were illegitimate. So you're seeing over time that a color boundary began to solidify in a way that didn't exist in the very early years of the colonies. Bacon's Rebellion provides a particularly interesting case study in exactly how it was that these color lines solidified in early Virginia, as well as the role that women played in politics as well as conflict in the early days of the colony. The uprising started with a split between the people who lived on the Virginia frontier, who were traditionally quite poor, and the ruling, very wealthy and powerful oligarchy that was quartered in Jamestown and led by their governor, William Berkeley. By the 1670s, almost everything about Virginia society had been rigged to favor the wealthy, and the frontier farmers were paying enormous amounts of taxes and getting almost nothing in return because the money very quickly went into the hands of a few politically connected families. This might sound familiar to you because we have something similar going on in American society today. So, in this conflict, the rebels, who came to include a number of black Virginians as well as poor white farmers, were generally the more sympathetic figures in the conflict, unless you happen to be a Native American, because one of the things that these poor frontier families were most bitterly complaining about was the fact that the governor, who already engaged in a profitable fur trade with local tribes, wouldn't share their enthusiasm for a genocidal war against the natives and refused to allow these frontiersmen to make war with the natives and to take their land. In fact, it was actually the frontier wives who most wanted to kill off the Native Americans because they were so frequently left alone in their remote homesteads that they feared for their safety. So when Nathaniel Bacon began a rebellion aimed at overthrowing Berkeley's government, the women took a role by spreading the word about his victories and about the governor's unwillingness to defend the colonial households, and oftentimes they used a strategy of gossip to spread this message. Women also seem to have taken part in the councils of war as well as the strategy planning, and Sarah Drummond, the wife of one of Nathaniel Bacon's top advisors, was a landowner in her own right and an important member of the leadership. When the rebels' resolve seemed to flag, she picked up a twig in front of them and snapped it in two and said, "I fear the power of England no more than a broken straw," causing men under Bacon to rally and to continue the fight. So we see throughout this conflict that the rebels didn't discriminate between sexes, either in their leadership or when attacking, and landowners that were loyal to the governor often left their wives behind in order to guard the estates, and their theory was that a lady's sex would actually be her best protection against any rebel raiders. But the rebels came in and took the houses and actually beat the wives the same way they would have men, and when Nathaniel Bacon stormed into Jamestown, he sent his troops to round up the wives of the most most prominent local men, including one of his own relatives. And to buy time for the rebels to strengthen their position, he placed a group of women along the top of a small fortification that he had constructed in order to stop government authorities from rushing the encampment of rebels. And this caused the government forces to hold their fire because they felt it would be wrong to fire on women due to the ingrained notions of gender that existed. And yet the role of these women and most other loyalist wives, you can see, was essentially passive, standing and guarding rather than actually fighting. The one exception to women throughout Bacon's rebellion being very passive and using things like networks of gossip to achieve their means is actually the wife of the governor. Her name was Lady Frances Berkeley, and for quite some time there had been critics of the governor who actually claimed that because she was much younger, she tortured him with her sexual demands and forced him to raise money to buy her luxuries to make up for his gross inadequacies in the bedroom. But that kind of theory has really been popular throughout history whenever men try to explain the political activities of a strong woman in a time period in which they're not supposed to have a voice. Whatever their relationship actually was, it became very clear during the rebellion that Sir William Berkeley was just a tired old man who wanted this to end, and his wife Frances had enough energy for an army. She fled over to London when the rebellion started, and she began lobbying in the king's court to gain support for her husband's faction, and she returned triumphant with 1 royal commissioner and 1,000 troops to fight against the rebels. And slowly order was restored, and this was made much easier once Nathaniel Bacon actually died. But Lady Berkeley responded quite bitterly to the fact that the king's representatives wanted to limit her husband's authority in order to assuage the fears of the rebels. And she was further angered when the commissioners refused to see the female rebels as anything more than hapless housewives that had been led astray. They just could not imagine that these women had willingly taken part in a rebellion. And in order to show her displeasure, she actually arranged to have the local hangman drive the commissioner's carriage, creating this huge scandal in their society. In the aftermath of Nathaniel Bacon's defeat, Governor Berkeley's forces rode throughout the farms of their former enemies and evicted the families and confiscated everything that they owned. And typically, women would not be punished as harshly as men. One woman who was charged with treason actually stood in front of the royal commissioners and begged for mercy. Sarah Grindon admitted that she had been an ignorant woman. She had spoken some foolish and indiscreet words, reflecting upon the sole prosecution of the Indian War, and said she was most heartily sorrowful for the same. So she played upon the ideas of innocence and the ignorance of women, and was successfully dismissed of all charges. In a lot of ways, the rebellion represented some important changes in early American society. The first was the hardening of racial boundaries, because authorities really feared after this rebellion that free African Americans would unite with free Anglo-Americans from poorer families, and they would overthrow the wealthy and the system that existed. The second is that prior to Bacon's rebellion, women certainly could use their brabbling speech and political gossip in order to achieve autonomy and power. And so patriarchal authorities felt justified when they cracked down on both miscegenation and female gossip. So by 1700, these very rigid ideas of race and gender had replaced what were much more flexible notions. Despite the fact that for most of the 17th century in the Chesapeake, there was a skewed sex ratio that really favored men over women, after Bacon's rebellion, and even just before it, you can see that Virginia's elite men were really uncomfortable with the increasing number of women and with the lack of control they had over them. So as the number of women grew, they became the focus of more of the Assembly's laws. And the first statute that they enacted in the session for 1662 was one called the Brabbling Women Statute that actually controlled women's gossip. Other laws were passed a little bit after this, and this is, for example, when they actually passed the law that the status of children born to an Englishman and a, quote, Negro woman, slave or free, was to follow the status of the mother, connecting sex, race, and socioeconomic status all in one law. The Assembly was also concerned with the labor status of white women, and they wrote two separate acts at this point, which I've mentioned before, in which black women who worked the fields were tithable, while white women who performed the same labor were not. And then, in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion in 1677, they even further intertwined these issues of gender and status when they enacted legislation that declared that a woman's speech could actually possibly be treasonous, and that any woman who spoke in a way that was tending towards rebellion could be punished for this. If she was a married woman, she would, on her first offense, receive 20 lashes. On a second offense, 30 lashes, and for a third, the Assembly would prosecute her as a rebel and a traitor. For a single, unmarried woman, she would, on her first offense, pay a £1,000 tobacco fine and stand in the pillory for a certain amount of time. Then this would be doubled for her second offense, and for a third she could be prosecuted for treason. And this allowed women with husbands who were willing and able to pay the fine to escape the more severe corporal punishment. So a woman's marital and socioeconomic status determined the severity of her punishment. At this point in the lecture, we have talked about variations in women's experience based upon their class as well as their race. And the last thing we're going to look at are variations based upon the location of where women lived. And because we've mostly focused on the Chesapeake region to this point, we're going to compare the lives of women in the New Netherlands, which was a colony that lived under Roman law, as well as those living in New England, so the Puritans and the Pilgrims. The colony of New Amsterdam was formed when Dutch traders, who were businessmen more than anything else, settled in Manhattan and created a commercial venture known as New Amsterdam in 1624. And then in 1664, the colony would actually be conquered by the British and come under the rule of Great Britain. And the lives of Dutch women in the New Netherlands really ran counter to the lives of other American colonial women. Dutch women were much more active and engaged participants in society, unlike the more submissive and hindered English counterparts. And during the period beginning in 1624 to just prior to the English takeover, New Netherland women were involved in all aspects of society, whether it was philanthropic, legal, business, or religious endeavors. They had a very keen understanding of personal rights under the Roman and Dutch law, and they functioned within a landscape of some legal equity. There was a leveling effect from life on the borderland that was reinforced through their status in the colony. Under the Dutch, women could inherit property and they could conduct business for themselves. And additionally, as a trade-centered colony, New Netherland demographics, which included a pretty large portion of non-Dutch people, allowed for a much more diverse and open society. Due to this diversity, women's roles within society highlighted their existing social freedoms. And though women did hold lesser legal status than men did, many took advantage of this less restrictive society in the 17th century. The women of New Netherland were unique in their time and their space because their social status enabled them semi-equitable civic, legal, and social involvement. To outsiders, Dutch women were often said to be very bossy and uncouth. They ignored what they believed were common social conventions throughout other European cultures, and girls in the Netherlands were reported to give orders to their older brothers, treating them as oafs and further acting unnaturally domineering over their husbands. It was also common for women in the Netherlands to work outside of the home and to travel while their men stayed at home. So English travelers to the Netherlands commonly described the reverse gender roles of the Dutch by stating, quote, "Nor would I be a Dutchman to have my wife, my sovereign, to command me." Yet it was much misconstrued that women were in fact in charge, as the Netherlands was patriarchal just like other European countries. Unlike British women living under coverture, women in New Amsterdam were active as plaintiffs and defendants in court records, attaining similar legal outcomes as men of that era. And between 1648 and 1700 in Albany, women were involved in 302 cases as either plaintiff or defendant. They were in court for a variety of reasons such as slander, business transactions, paternity suits, and settlement of debts. Though women constituted 16.5% of all civil cases in the New Amsterdam records, very few were involved in any criminal activity. In violent cases where women were convicted, they were punished with leniency, usually fined, and exceptions were when women would beat men. They were told to beg for forgiveness in front of the court and warned of banishment if the crime were to occur again. The testimony and rights of women were safeguarded and satisfied at a surprising rate, which underscored their status in society. So if we look at just one case illustrating women's position as acceptable court witnesses, we can look at one that took place in October of 1662, in which Gretchen Westerkamp brought Peter Jacobson to court, claiming that he was her baby's father. Jacobson denied being the father and rejected the idea of marrying her without any proof of paternity. A deposition was taken by 7 women who were present at the birth, and thus they certified that Westerkamp swore 3 times that Jacobson was the father. During this period, it was the custom to question pregnant women, like the 12 angry women, while in the throes of childbirth to identify the father. At the point of birth, they reasoned that a woman was in such a state she was unable to lie, and these women were accepted as authentic witnesses in court, reflecting the level of female rights within society and the important role of women as midwives. Women's regard as compelling witnesses, coupled with their ability to support other women, and the court's desire for the child's financial support by naming a father, demonstrates women's social relevance. The case was eventually settled in favor of Jacobson, who was allowed to marry as he wished, but was ordered to pay a fine for having lain with Westerkamp in the first place. And although she failed to win the case, she did utilize the courts to seek civic restitution, which is not something that was frequently done by British women. When in the courthouse, women used strong language and they appeared fearless, both when they were discussing monetary issues and when they were confronting religious authorities. The women of New Netherland did not really appear to fear religious figures or personal harm if they were confronted. In addition to some political rights, women were very well aware of the freedom of religion which governed the Dutch Republic. The 17th century Dutch were unlike other European powers regarding religion, and the Netherlands had really become a haven for a variety of faiths like the Portuguese Jews, the English sectarians and the Quakers, and the French Huguenots. Since some religious tolerance was present in Dutch society, it's not really surprising to find examples of women standing up boldly to church authorities regarding their religious choice. Dutch women had a very strong role in business, as they might own a business themselves or act as a deputy husband. A deputy husband is essentially when a woman will take over for a man in a time of crisis when he must be away from the business. So, for example, during the American Revolution, many women stepped up and acted as deputy husbands. Women not only took part in these business operations, but also represented their business interests before the courts. And statistical data suggests that under Dutch authority, females attained positions outside the domestic sphere much more often than under later English rule. Numbers of female traders and proprietors dropped off significantly, although the decline was more rapid in New Amsterdam as opposed to the outlying settlement of Albany. While married women were restricted in some legal matters in New Amsterdam, single women held the ability of full control over their own legal interests. For married women, their husbands acted as guardians and gained full control over their property, including their businesses and their land. But women in New Netherlands had privileges like the ability to own land and the right to inheritance, and women were awarded equal property rights because of that traditional Roman law of their homeland. In marriage, women were considered equal and they were afforded the opportunity of community property. And this Dutch practice dated all the way back to the early Middle Ages and remained part of the New Netherland law until the British took over. And unlike the English, who practiced the concept of primogeniture, where the oldest male in the family was the recipient of the father's property, the Dutch system did allow women the right of inheritance and joint wills. At least half of the wills that were drawn up and filed before 1700 were actually joint, and women's legal status really extended their ability to attain power of attorney for husbands, sons, and other men in their family. When it comes to female sexuality, in New Netherland, instances of sexual activity and lack of punishment for premarital acts was actually quite commonplace, and it varied very much from that of their Puritan neighbors. Surprisingly, sexual activity among colonial women on the Hudson was discussed in court without very much modesty. Blatant sexual activity was recorded in court cases that contained just humiliating terms regarding women, and instances of extramarital or premarital pregnancy exist in these records. From 1670 to 1685, the Albany courts handled 8 different cases regarding children born out of wedlock, of which 3 revealed that the mother had slept with more than one man around the time of conception. And the rates of premarital pregnancy in New Netherlands were quite high when compared to the British colonies. But during the colonial period, embarrassment about premarital pregnancy was really not about the fact that sex had been conducted outside of marriage. It was more that it was shameful if a man was unwilling to marry the woman he had impregnated, because it would mean that the community would be responsible for taking care of the child. And likewise, these extramarital affairs are seen occurring repeatedly in the court documents. Although a lot of men and women were religiously loyal and chaste, when examples of extracurricular sexual activity occurred, Dutch colonial society showed no real record of punishment by death as prescribed by the law, which was very common in the New England colonies. And in New Netherland, judges were unbalanced between genders, as men who fathered illegitimate children were punished for a lack of fiscal responsibility, but women who gave birth to illegitimate children were viewed as being a greater harm to society for birthing and creating a moral offense. So women's punishment was not really fair, but the penalty was not death. And the difference was that women had created a moral problem and men had created a financial issue for the community. One of the last aspects we should look at in the New Netherlands is the relationship that women had with philanthropic efforts. And Dutch benevolence was certainly replicated in the New Netherlands, and it offers insights into the attitudes and care that their society expounded. In a society where philanthropic activity exists, so too are women as administrators and recipients of this aid and these opportunities. And one such example where women were incorporated in a necessary role was that of care for the poor and sick in Fort Orange, for example. It was a unique civic duty to aid the needy rather than imposed compulsory taxes, which you would see in British colonies where they forced people to take care of the poor. Instead, the poor were helped voluntarily, and there were preventative poor relief that was organized through voluntary donations, poor boxes, and church services by deacons and also by local women. Assistance was also awarded in the form of care for the sick, of which women were the primary caregivers. The area of knowledge has limited information, and its effects on women's lives is still kind of a point of speculation. Women who nursed the sick were given payments of meat and other necessities, and the church provided awards to such women who ensured that the ill were properly taken care of. Churches were another outlet for females to work beyond the domestic sphere at home, and their presence there helped to ensure the health of society. Another mandated institution that served the social needs of New Netherland was the existence of orphan masters, and according to the law, every person under 25 years of age, as well as persons above that age who on account of mental or other disability were deemed incompetent to manage their own affairs, had to be provided with a guardian. And women often administered the colony's incompetent and disabled citizens. The benevolent practices brought over to the colony were then replicated in these small communities, and women certainly held a key role in aiding those in need. Despite women's purported bossiness in New Netherlands and many of the privileges and powers that they had, there were some less positive aspects of New Netherland that Dutch women had to endure. As in most societies, there was physical abuse. Occupying a subservient role to men, women were often the victims of verbal and physical abuse, and few court cases of women's attempts to seek help were recorded, but there were likely many abuse cases that were never recorded. We do have one case in which Elsa Gerrits pleaded before the court to have her incarcerated husband released in order to work for her, despite his having beaten both herself and her child. And these really illuminate the hardships that women have faced. In an act of desperation, she appealed for her husband's freedom despite the fact that he had abused her. Now, fines for assaults toward others outside of one's family unit were usually taken more seriously than internal abuse. Though a few cases were recorded of women beating other women, most of the cases of abuse involved men beating their wives, which suggests that women had a submissive position. And some cases involved very severe beatings, and the court handed out lesser punishment when they were marital cases as opposed to those of unrelated people, which suggests to historians that within marriage or family units, the idea that a man owned his wife or daughter certainly existed in the New Netherlands. The end of New Amsterdam came in 1664, when the British sailed 4 of their frigates into the harbor and took the colony as their own without a whole lot of actual fighting. So New Amsterdam became New York, which was really a mixed blessing. On the one hand, the population doubles in the decade after British takeover, but British rule really took away a lot of the freedom that Dutch women had under Roman law, and they were now under British common law and coverture. Also, under the English, free black people lost a lot of the jobs they had under the Dutch, and a lot of that religious and ethnic diversity began to be lost. Women lost a lot of their rights as well, and while Dutch control ended, citizens really struggled to resist assimilation to the British ways, and the Dutch culture remained intact and began to intermingle with British culture in time. The other well-known early 17th century colonies in New England were both Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, and these are the last ones that we're going to discuss women's roles in. Now, the people who settled in Plymouth, Massachusetts were pilgrims, and they were exiled from Holland, and they wanted to separate from the Anglican Church and come to the New World and create a new life. Those who settled in Massachusetts Bay were Puritans, and they were interested in purifying the Anglican Church because they believed that this church still had too many of the Catholic tendencies that existed prior to the Protestant Reformation. Both of these groups were certainly subject to persecution in England, especially after the Catholic Stuart family replaced Queen Elizabeth on the throne. So most of the people moving to New England were of the middling sort. They came from, the middle class and could afford to pay for their own voyage across the ocean to the New World. This means that there's going to be relatively few indentured servants in comparison to the South. And in contrast to other colonies, people migrated to New England in family units. No one, not even young men, were permitted to live outside of a family group, whereas in Virginia, for example, they specifically recruited unmarried young people. There was a far more even sex ratio than in the South, and lastly, it was really important for people to recreate the lives of what they had in Europe by settling down into towns and villages, and this gave them a sense of economic opportunity as well as greater protection, and they needed protection from Native American attacks as well as attacks from other European countries such as New France. And it also created an environment in which they could be responsible for moral stewardship over one another, in which they essentially regulated, in a sort of nosy way, the affairs of their neighbors to ensure that they were living a godly life. Unlike in the southern colonies, where women ended up having a great deal of control and influence because of the uneven sex ratio in the early years, the Puritans never allowed things to become so disorderly that the normal lines of male dominance got blurred. And the Puritans believed that the husband represented God's authority in the household and that women had the right to the love and support of their spouse, but they did not have the right to question his judgment. Women were viewed as the daughters of Eve, as being morally weak and easily led to error, and they lived under British common law and under the system of coverture that we've talked about before, in which married women had their legal rights subsumed by that of their husband, and they could no longer inherit anything, own property, own their own wages, sign a contract, or testify in a court of law. When you learned about colonial New England in the past, you may have heard the term goodwife, and that's because in the 17th century, the way that an ordinary statist woman would be referred to is to call her a good wife, and sometimes that would be shortened to goody. So it's the same kind of way that you might call a woman Mrs. and then her last name today. And most ordinary women would have lived on farms, and they would have woken up at about 4 in the morning and made breakfast for their families by 5 or 5:30. They would wake the children, feed the livestock, churn the butter, prepare lunch, tend the garden, clean the house, herd and milk the cows, hoe the cabbage, prepare dinner, get the children ready for bed. They would also knit linen and cotton and make candles and soap, comb spun and bleached and wove wool to make clothing. They would hem the sheets and sew quilts, mend, alter, and knit the family clothing, wash the laundry, haul the water, chop the wood. They would teach their daughters to sew and to spin wool so that they in turn could knit stockings, dishcloths, caps, and mittens. They performed medical aid for injured livestock and for family injuries. And because of the high rate of childbirth, many of these women, while doing all of this work, would give birth every other year for a decade or more, and they would perform these tasks even when they were pregnant. Colonial women reached the height of their powers in middle age, when they were no longer burdened by continual pregnancy and had daughters old enough to help with domestic enterprises. The birth of a daughter was welcomed in most colonial families, because while they needed sons to help in the fields, they also needed girls to assist their moms inside. And although a prosperous matron had no real voice in the public arena, she was supposed to take a leading role inside of the private sphere of the home. A competent housewife earned the respect of her husband, who could see firsthand the value of her labors. The farmer who slaughtered a pig needed his wife to make the sausages, process the bacon, and preserve the pork. As he sat by the fireside at night, mending his fishing net or fixing his tools, he could watch her turning the flax he had harvested and the wool he had sheared into the family's clothes. The candle that lit their way to bed came from her hand, as did the vegetables, eggs, cheese, and chicken they ate, and the beer or the cider they drank. They were very much partners in the family business, and if the man was at all sensible, he understood how critical his wife was to their mutual success. Childbearing dominated the lives of early female settlers, and the average woman in New England actually married before her 20th birthday and gave birth to about 7 children. She nursed each baby for anywhere from 12 to 18 months, and nursing, which suppressed ovulation, served as a rough form of birth control in the earliest years of the colonies. Now, childbirth was certainly a communal affair, and it was the great moment for the gathering of neighborhood women while their men waited on the other side of the door as passive outsiders. The early stages of labor were party-like, as was the celebration at the end of a successful delivery, and the women would get together and they would dine on fancy meat and tarts and cheese, and then when a woman was ready to deliver, the mother-to-be would squat over a low open-seated stool or sit in another woman's lap. And if there was a lactating woman in the group, and there almost always was, she nursed the baby first because a new mother's milk was believed to be impure. During very difficult childbirths, the woman in labor was urged to drink another woman's milk. And when the crisis was over, there were generally bawdy jokes told about the umbilical cord. A long one for a boy meant he would grow a sizable member, and a girl's was supposed to be cut short or she would become immodest. Eventually, the husband was allowed to re-enter the room, and the world of women gave way to the patriarchal family. And midwives were a critical resource in colonial communities. The normally apolitical matrons of Boston went on a virtual strike when their favorite midwife came under attack by the church elders. Several New England towns provided a rent-free house for their midwife, and in New Amsterdam, midwives were actually public servants who received rather large salaries. This didn't happen in New England, but they were still well respected there. The support of the midwife and female neighbors during delivery was the emotional center of women's community, but it was also a matter of life and death. About 1/5 of the pregnant women in New England died giving birth, and the figures were much higher in the South. Cotton Mather, ever one to look on the bright side, advised pregnant women that preparation for death is that most reasonable and seasonable thing to which you must now apply yourself. Wealthy women had special sets of childbed linens which they put on their beds after delivery was completed. If tragedy occurred, the linens became the woman's shroud. In an era in which masculine bravery was celebrated, It was the women who actually dared to stare down death on a regular basis. Since they were almost always either pregnant or nursing an infant, colonial women spent their lives in a continual balancing act, in which the dangers of overexertion had to be weighed against the simple necessity of getting through the day. The 40-pound pots had to be lifted on and off the fire, no matter what the mother's condition. Colonial-era Americans harbored many theories about the delicacy of expectant mothers and danger to the fetus if she should be surprised or confronted with an unpleasant object. A woman who saw a deformed beggar in the street, they believed, might give birth to a deformed baby. However, these were yet another series of rules that could be suspended whenever necessary. If a wife's services were needed in an area that was replete with alarming surprises, say working in the fields of a frontier farm while under threat of Indian attack, she was expected to do her job, pregnancy or no. Women traveled while they were pregnant, but once a baby was born, they tended to stay close to home while nursing. Some women took weaning trips when the baby was in its first year to make the withdrawal of the maternal breast easier on the mother, at least. In crisis, a friend might provide courtesy nursing to a mother in need of help. Sometimes her own mother could do the favor. In a culture in which women began to have children very young and continued until fairly late in life, it wasn't at all unusual for mother and daughter to be pregnant at the same time. Given the amount of suckling that went on, there was obviously a lot of concern about how to treat sore breasts, and one popular physician recommended a poultice. Take new milk and grate white bread into it, then take mallows and red rose leaves. 1 handful of each, then chop them small and boil them together till it be thick, and put some honey and turpentine and mix them, then spread it on a cloth and apply it. In accordance with the very strict religious values of both Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, sexuality was really meant to be channeled into the confines of marriage, and church leaders and law officials told people that this should be performed only for the purpose of procreation. But just like in New Amsterdam and just like in the Chesapeake, certainly there were multiple instances of what would have been viewed as sexual immorality. However, the punishment that was doled out in New England was far harsher than those that might have been given in New Amsterdam. For example, adultery, fornication, bestiality, and sodomy could all be punished with death, and rape also could be punishable by death. And unlike New Amsterdam, where in cases where capital punishment could be a punishment doled out, in New England, it actually was doled out on occasion. Now, certainly they didn't go throwing out the death penalty very often, and it wouldn't have been used very often for something like adultery, but sodomy or bestiality would certainly have been a much harsher crime that would have been punished much more harshly. With such strict penalties compared to New Amsterdam, there were much lower rates of premarital pregnancy. They remained just under 10% for most of the colonial era. And it's not really surprising given the way that they dealt with what they viewed as sexual immorality, because not only could people be brought in front of the legal court system, but they could also be brought in front of an ecclesiastical court, which is a church court. And if you can imagine having to stand in front of your church congregation and admit to your sexual misdeeds, that's exactly what would happen. And oftentimes, once you admitted to sexual misconduct and you accepted your punishment, which was usually a fine and whipping or time in the pillory, then you could come back after you had apologized and you could rejoin the fold of the church. It wasn't something that was going to label or brand you for your entire life, usually. Much like in New Amsterdam, domestic violence was a big problem in the New England colonies, and most can be categorized as either child abuse or the abuse of a female spouse. Willful murder and rapes are both listed under the category of capital offenses liable to death in the New England colonies. The fact that the word willful is alongside murder is of great significance upon the analysis of murder cases of women. More than once, the fact that the word willful is used prevented the death sentence from being carried out. Equally, rape was punishable with the death sentence, though this was usually a rare sentencing. Regardless, the fact that rape is very infrequently mentioned in the court records, and when it is, it's not typically punished to the full extent of the law, demonstrates the fact that male domination and power in these colonies is present. But this was already obvious from the setup of their government, and that women were not allowed in positions of authority. Spousal abuse, in comparison to other types of domestic violence in places like Plymouth Colony, was a really big problem. Out of the 10 instances found in the court records of actual violence towards a spouse not ending in murder, 8 charges were brought up against men and 2 against women. There most likely were more instances of husbands abusing their wives, but as with child abuse, much of it probably went underreported or unreported due to the acceptance of male dominance in the colony. Correction of the spouse was probably expected from time to time and was thus not reported. Likewise, there may have been more than 2 instances of wives abusing their husbands in Plymouth Colony, but due to the idea of male dominance, reporting such behavior could have been embarrassing for the abused husband. Regardless, the cases that are mentioned in the court records are very interesting, and they shed a great deal of light on the relationship between spouses in the colony. What's interesting to look at in respect to spousal abuse is the punishment received by the offender. Since there was no specific punishment laid out in the colony's laws, the punishment was up to the court to decide, and the punishment for spousal abuse varies from fines to whipping or even to sitting in the stocks for more violent abuse, and this variation is due to the lack of set standards. However, one thing that scholars have noticed is that women were typically punished far more harshly for abusing their husbands than for husbands abusing their female spouses. Massachusetts authorities enforced both a civil and a religious law based on the Bible, and it was especially based off of the teachings of St. Paul, who said to the Corinthians in the Bible, quote, "Let your women keep silence in the churches, and if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home." So when these women went to church, they sat completely apart from the men, and they even entered and exited through a separate door. They were never permitted to speak during services or to have any position of leadership. Nor did they have a formal say in the selection of a minister or any other community matters. So women who attempted to shirk this sort of tradition would often get into a good deal of trouble. Anne Hutchinson is probably the most famous example of this, and Anne believed that she could be a leader in the church and went around preaching the gospel to people out in public, and she was eventually excommunicated from her village, which ultimately led to her dying because of an Indian attack when she was out in an area where she was unprotected. Now, in 1623, William Bradford responded to some of the critiques by Europeans that the Puritan women, in fact, had much more control in church than they should. And he said, quote, "Touching our government, you are mistaken if you think we admit women, for they are excluded, as both reason and nature teacheth they should be." So women were excluded from any kind of governing position in the church because they lacked any intelligence, and because this was their natural state as God had created them. And yet there were certainly limits to the subjugation of women in New England. The Puritan women especially had crossed a large ocean in these very small ships to get to America, and they weren't feeling particularly deferential. And we have several examples of this, such as when the residents of Chabaco wanted to build a new meeting house, the men traipsed off to Boston to get permission to do so, while the women just went about building the meeting house when they were gone. And the court records are chock full of examples of women who gave it as good as they got it in verbal and sometimes even physical battles with Puritan men. By the time we get to the mid-1600s, the Massachusetts authorities are complaining that teenagers are sneaking off and joining gangs where they go to co-ed parties or they get together with girlfriends and they sing bawdy songs. And as the colonies become more and more commercialized as they get larger, they attract non-Puritan residents who don't have the same worldview as the Puritans did. So it wouldn't be uncommon for a very respectable young lady walking around the port of Boston to receive bawdy calls from sailors. In fact, between 1671 and 1687, the Boston Selectmen drove 46 women out of town for bad behavior, and this included things like drinking with men in taverns and walking around with their breasts exposed or wearing men's clothing in public. And although women weren't supposed to hold positions that belonged to the head of household, they frequently did so anyways. Single women and widows had the ability legally to conduct business, and by 1687, more than 10% of the people involved in trade in Boston were actually female, and most of them were widows. Many businesses that were theoretically operated by men were actually conducted by their wives while they were at sea or traveling or engaged in some other commercial pursuit, which means much like in New Netherlands, these women were acting as deputy husbands. These wives were accepted as merchants and farmers and printers, as store managers. As long as they didn't take the title, they would be accepted. A few jobs like tavern and innkeeping were actually seen as a natural extension of a housewife's hospitality. And midwives, of course, were almost universally women. Despite all of the economic contributions that women made to colonial society, they did not lead to greater independence. One would believe that with such significant contributions to the economy and their employment as widows, that women of the era would have had more freedoms. But on the contrary, women's contributions did not necessarily translate into control over the resources, and women often spent most of their lives as subordinates to fathers, then eventually to husbands. Women's statuses were dependent on their legal status of marriage and often lacked access to education. But rarely did women feel as if they were being wronged or unappreciated. The doctrine of the time called for a woman to fulfill the roles of a housewife, a deputy husband, a consort, a mother, a mistress, a neighbor, and a Christian, all while remaining anonymous. At this point, we've reached the end of our lecture on colonial women's lives, and hopefully you've learned a good bit about variations in the lives of women as dictated by their race, the location of their residence, and even their class and social hierarchy. But hopefully you've also noticed that there are a lot of similarities in colonial women's lives, regardless of those factors. All colonial settlements were patriarchal in nature, and women did not have the same rights as men. While they could sometimes leave the private sphere when in accordance with their societal norms, they were generally expected to take care of the home, to reproduce, to take care of the children, and to ensure the success of the family from indoors. Women were always under the protection of their husbands and their fathers, and thus they were never experiencing the same degree of freedom as colonial men, and much of this is because women were believed to be inferior intellectually as well as morally because they were descendants of Eve. But despite all of this, whether it came in the form of networks of gossip, stepping in for a departed husband as a deputy husband, or working as a midwife, all women found some means of expressing autonomy and exerting their influence on society and the family.